Thanks so much for joining us today in this series on how to start a nonprofit. So after we did the one before on to be or not to be a nonprofit, you must have decided, there's something there. I want to just explore just a little bit more and see what next steps would be as to how I can start a nonprofit. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Information you need to form a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I'm Robin Thompson, and I am a nonprofit consultant. I am based in Vail, Colorado, and I have helped start a number of nonprofits. I've worked with nonprofits, and I do work with nonprofits all across the U.S. I have a couple of international clients, and the nonprofits I work with are anywhere from small startups to nonprofits who've been around for a long time. And so I want to break this down into a way that is bite-sized and manageable for you, because sometimes it can be rather daunting when you try to look at what do I need to do to start a nonprofit? What about all the paperwork that I need to file? So I'm going to share my screen with you. And like I said, this is the nonprofit series, and this is number 2 that we will have done. If you watched number 1 or you were there, you know that there was an assignment that I gave you. I gave you these 5 questions. Our nonprofit represents the people who what? We do what better than any other organization? The results of what we do is easily seen by what? No one can blank as well as we can, and the impact of our work is what? The answer to all these questions are what's going to help you be able to fill out the paperwork that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the agenda. We're going to talk about steps for establishing a nonprofit, what and where to file to get your 501c3 status, and what to include in your bylaws. Now, one of the things that I may have mentioned this last time, but I just want to be sure that you understand that you don't have to get a 501c3 status to have a nonprofit. You can have something called a fiscal agent. That's FISCAL. What that means is that you go to a nonprofit and you tell them what you're doing and ask them if people can give donations, if they can give gifts, and if they will handle that fiscal, the financial piece of it. Now, sometimes nonprofits charge to be able to do that. Other times they're just willing to help you be able to get started, and then you can determine after that if you want to go ahead and go with a 501c3. And the interesting thing about that is that you get the tax document. So the organization that's your fiscal agent sends out a tax receipt. So people do get a tax receipt for that. You don't have to have a fiscal agent. Once you submit your 501c3 paperwork, you can start raising money. So let's talk about next steps for setting up your nonprofit. And we're going to go into not excruciating detail, but somewhat detail, just so you'll know what steps that you need to go through. We'll talk about establishing core values and the name of your organization and how important that is, developing your bylaws and forming your board, appointing a registered agent, filing your articles of incorporation, filing for an EIN, which is an employer identification number, getting a business license, filing the IRS Form 1023, and applying for, if you're in the state of Colorado, a Colorado tax exemption, or if you're in some other state. Now we're going to break those down step by step. So let's talk about first about establishing the core values and a name. first thing you need to do is those questions, the things that I had you fill in the blank. That's going to help you in writing your mission statement and coming up with a plan for the nonprofit. And then you need to determine your name. What is your nonprofit going to be called? And this is, I don't want to say it's permanent, but once you do get your name, it's somewhat convoluted to try to go by a different name and to change that name. There was one organization that I worked with. They started out being called World Class Accessibility Foundation. I'd helped them start a nonprofit, and they had started this with the name before I got involved. The problem was people couldn't spell the word accessibility. So you think about it, when it's ACCESS, and is it ability, ABILITY, or is it IBILITY? And granted, for a URL for your website, you can buy both the correct spelling and the misspelling. But when you think about all the other places like social media that it exists, and if people, number one, can't spell it, and number two, that was such a long name. So we went through to change that name, and we did get it changed to Access Unbound. But now everything that they do has to be World Class Accessibility Foundation, DBA, doing business as Access Unbound. And so it just adds another layer to it, that if you decide in the beginning and you're sure about what your name is, and you pass it in front of people and ask people what they think of it, it's going to be much easier on you. So you determine that name, and then you do a search on the Secretary of State's website. Now, I'm going to show you what that page looks like. So I'm going to share my screen. And if you're in the state of Colorado, this will be the website that comes up, the Colorado Secretary of State. And you can see it. It asks you, enter the name you want to use in Colorado, and then there's a name search done. Now, it doesn't have to be that it's the exact same name for them to turn you down, but if it could be confused with your name, if your name sounds like something else. So that is one of the first things that you will do when you're applying for your articles of incorporation. So we will talk a little bit about that. Okay, so that's step number one. Step number two, you want to develop your bylaws and form your board. Now, you may say, oh, we can do the bylaws later. But the thing with the bylaws are, they are required by the IRS for filing your 501c3, which is your 1023 paperwork to receive your 501c3. So working on those bylaws, and I'll show you an example of them in just a second. So one of the things I see people get confused is there is an example of a purpose statement on your screen right now. And what the purpose statement is, it's what your nonprofit will do. And this goes into your bylaws. It will help you tremendously when you are trying to explain to people, when you're trying to explain to potential board members. And so it says things like to provide coaching and consulting from volunteers with business experience to nonprofit organizations on ethical and value-based leadership, to train ambassadors, to raise public awareness, to educate, to partner. So you see how these bullet items are all action verbs, because this is the purpose of your organization. And this is written in bullet points. And there's another piece that a lot of people get confused when they are completing their 1023 paperwork, when it says specifically, do not repeat what you have written in your bylaws for your purpose. So, like we said, the bylaws are required for your IRS filing. You need to form your board. You need to find people who are passionate about what you do. And then one piece that I don't know whether that when people file for their 501c3, they leave this piece out. I don't know how they get past the IRS if they leave it out, but if they didn't leave it out, sometimes they just have trouble following this conflict of interest policy. And I was just talking to a nonprofit where when I heard some of the things that the board was doing, I wasn't sure that they were following that conflict of interest policy. So here's what that looks like. I was working with one board where there was a vice president of the bank who sat on the board. This particular nonprofit had a loan with the bank that the board member sat on. So the board member had to disclose it in the conflict of interest statement. And then when there was any discussion around the mortgage, the loan, then that board member had to recuse himself and he could not vote. But the IRS wants that to be a part of your bylaws so they know that you have that conflict of interest policy in place. And then you want to be sure you conduct your first board meeting before September the 7th. So let me just show you an example of what those bylaws look like. So that's not what the bylaws look like. So let me try again. Here we go. So if you search on the internet, you will find bylaws. And that's fine to use it as a guide. All attorneys, do this differently. The Article 1, what's the name of the organization? Article 2, charitable purposes under Section 501c3. So as you see that there are different areas, the offices, the board of directors, etc. If you just search for this on the internet or you have one to go by that somebody else has done, go ahead and use it, but please go talk to an attorney in Colorado or whatever state you're in. The Colorado Nonprofit Association has a partnership with pro bono attorneys. And I'm not sure if you need to be a member of the Colorado Nonprofit Association, but it's fairly inexpensive. They've got lots of great resources and the access to attorneys, which you can't find many pro bono attorneys unless you have one on your board. So I was talking about the purpose. So those were the statements, the bullet points that I was telling you that need to go in your bylaws. So that's what this looks like. So this is Article 2, the charitable purposes of the nonprofit and what it's going to do, broken down in, letters. Okay, so that's what your bylaws are going to look like, and they take quite a bit of time. So be sure that you give yourself ample amount of time to create those bylaws, and then as part of that, you're going to conduct your first board meeting, because the 1023, the IRS 1023 that you're going to fill out is going to ask you if your bylaws have been accepted by the board. So this can be an outline for your first board meeting: approving the bylaws, appointing officers, setting an accounting period and tax year. So to some people, it just makes sense. Well, why wouldn't you do a regular tax year from January 1st to December 31st of that year? But think about ski industry businesses, ski industry nonprofits, that December cuts off the ski season. So many of them will go until the end of April or the end of May, and then their next year will start in June. That helps them. So you need to set that accounting year. You can set that accounting tax years to any period that you want. You need to improve initial transactions of the corporation. One of the things you'll need to do is a corporate bank account. you will need your articles of incorporation to be able to open that bank account. And then after the meeting, you're going to need to keep minutes of all your meetings, and be sure you set up a corporate binder. Okay, so you need to have a registered agent. Now, this is different than what we talked about earlier, where we talked about a physical agent. The registered agent, this is probably one of the easiest steps in there, because you are probably going to be the registered agent. And so it's your name and your address but you need to determine that. The IRS wants to know, if somebody sues you, who is that person? Who is the legal person of that nonprofit? Okay, so here's what I want you to do for your very first knowledge test. What's the first step you need to take to form your nonprofit? Do you need to, 1, establish core values, 2, determine a name, or 3, determine a registered agent? Which one of the 3? Okay, so if I saw you right now, you'd say, wait a minute, you had number 1 as establish core values and determine a name. So I tricked you, because it's both 1 and 2, to establish your core values and also to determine a name. Okay, so now you're ready to file your articles of incorporation. So what are the articles of incorporation? Well, some people get a little bit confused because it sounds very similar to starting a business. And it is. If you looked at that list of things that need to be done, it is very similar to starting a business. It's just you take a different route when you're doing that. So filing the articles of incorporation, it's not like you're an LLC. It's not like you're an S corporation. These are the articles of incorporation in the state of Colorado. Now, other states call them different things. I just helped a nonprofit get started in Texas, and they called it something totally different. And Texas required a lot more information to be able to file those articles of incorporation. But it's the same Secretary of State site that I just showed you earlier, and it's fairly easy to get those articles of incorporation. So when you do go to the Secretary of State's site, there will be small businesses. There's a lot of things that you'll scroll through until you get to the one that says nonprofit corporations. And then it's the very first one, the articles of incorporation for a nonprofit corporation. And you can file online, but word of warning here, once you get started, you have to finish. It's not like you can save it and go back. So as you see here, there's a sample form that's a PDF. I would suggest filling that out so that you have all the information you need when you get ready to go online and fill it out. Okay, so this is all you need for the articles of incorporation. You see how easy it is. Your name, the entity's name, the street address, and just so you know, a lot of these forms want not only a post office box, but they also want a street address. For me, that ends up being a nightmare for many different reasons, because they want a street address, but they don't understand when you say we don't get home delivery. And so then they try to mail something to that home address and it gets returned. Sometimes it's very difficult to get them to understand that, but you do have to have both a street address and a mailing address. We talked about the registered agent, the purpose of the nonprofit, and those are the items that you're going to list out in your bylaws. Delayed effective date, that's optional. I would suggest not doing that. If you're not ready to file, just don't file until you're ready. The name and the title of the person with the vested legal title, and then any other additional information that you need. So that's all you need to file your articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. Now you're ready for step number 5. That is getting your employee identification number. You've got to wait, though, until you get your articles of incorporation. You've got to get that information because they're going to ask you to submit that along with your application for EIN. So usually the Secretary of State, the name search is done, etc. I mean, at least in Colorado, it happens pretty quickly. Now, Texas, it took several weeks before that they got theirs back. Ours was all online, and it was great because it went pretty quickly. So looking at your employer identification number, and again, this is just asking just things like your mailing address, your registered agent, and all of that. Okay, so that's number 5. And so then let's look at number 6, which is getting a business license. Now, I live in an unincorporated area, and so I don't have to have a city license, but I do need a county business license to operate. So check with your local authorities and see, do you need a city license? Do you need a county license? And just be sure that you have all the licenses that you need. Okay, here's another knowledge test. When should you have your first board meeting? Before writing the bylaws, before determining a registered agent, or before filing the 1023 with the IRS? Okay, so if you answered before filing the 1023 with the IRS, you are correct that you need to have a board meeting because it asks you if the board has adopted the bylaws. Okay, you're ready to file the Form 1023. So this is the IRS form that when it comes back, you will be a 501c3 nonprofit. Now, I will issue a caution here. They revised the 1023 form in January 2020, but when you do a search for this form, you'll come up with one prior to that, and the form changed. So I had a nonprofit who started filling out the old form, and then when they got ready to transfer it onto the 1023, it was totally different. So there's several sections that are different. So be sure that you have the one that was revised at least as early as January 2020. And you need to create a pay.gov account. That's where then you will submit your payment, because right now all you've paid is for the Secretary of State for the Articles of Incorporation. And at least in Colorado, that is $50. So, but this is going to be a little bit more. Now, the EIN number, I've always paid for EIN numbers. The last one was $245, but I saw some places online that says that nonprofits do not have to pay for an EIN number. So I'm not really sure. That's one of those that if you do the paperwork for a 501c3 nonprofit, if you could let me know, because I can't go through the form to see unless I'm going to form a business. So I can't see if they actually charge. So if you would let me know, I'd appreciate it. But the Form 1023, at least right now, it's $245, and you will submit that into your pay.gov account. Okay, so there is something you will see that when you search, it's going to come up with an EZ form, a 1023 EZ. So the question is, should you file that EZ? Because it is much easier. I mean, the form is probably only 2 pages long, and it doesn't cost as much either. I don't know off the top of my head how much it costs. But here's what you need to decide before you go for the EZ form. First, if you think you will bring in more than $50,000 a year in donations for each of the next 3 years, if you're going to bring in less than that, the easy form can work for you. But if there's any chance that you're going to raise more than $50,000, don't do the easy. But I think probably even a bigger detriment to that easy form is that it's harder to get grant funding, because here's why. When you submit your 1023, granting foundations know that you have been vetted by the IRS. You have given them lots of information, and they have looked at your nonprofit and they have given you a stamp of approval. The easy form, not so much. So if you think you'll apply for grant funding, I wouldn't suggest going for the easy either. But I'm giving you a link to it so you can take a look at it if you decide to go that route. Okay, so there's 9 parts to that Form 1023. And we're going to go just an overview of it. The basic organizational information, organizational structure, required provisions, the NTEE code, an activity description, and that's the activity description I was telling you about. The compensation, who's going to get paid, how much are they going to get paid, the financial information, you need to put a chart in there. How much money do you anticipate bringing in? How much do you anticipate spending? And that's very hard to do because you're not sure. You're not sure how much you're going to spend. Classification for the foundation, most of the time it's either going to be public, private, community foundation, and then the date of exemption and other exemptions. And then you'll upload your organizing documents and your bylaws. And of course, you'll sign it. Okay, so basic organizational information, the structure, what does your board look like? Do you have a president, etc.? What's required of the provisions, things like the conflict of interest policy, and then the NTE code and the activity descriptions. So this is what the NTE code looks like, the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. There are a ton of these. So I believe you can only pick one category, and you have to tell them where your nonprofit fits. And sometimes that's hard because sometimes it doesn't fit under any of these. Okay, so one of the things that they're going to ask you is for an activity description. And that activity description, again, it describes the past, present, and planned activities. And here's where I copied this right out of off the form. Don't refer to or repeat the purposes in your organizing document or speculate about potential future programs. This is the make or break as to whether that they give you your 501c3 status, is how do you tell them what you're going to do? And this is a narrative. The other one was just bullet points. And they will determine your exempt status. They actually ask you this question: what is the activity? Who conducts the activity? Where is it conducted? What percentage of time is spent allocated to the activity? How is the activity funded? And how does the activity further your exempt purposes? So here's an example of that. If you plan to further educational purposes by operating an after-school homework club, you would describe that activity rather than saying something like, you're going to further educational purposes. So you see the difference. It's more specific, and it helps them determine if that your nonprofit is a nonprofit. Here's another: create training materials. There's going to be 25% of the executive director's time is going to be doing this. And then you describe, initially, the nonprofit name will focus on creating material and content marketing, fundraising, and other company-related tasks expected to occupy approximately 25% of the ED's time. Again, this is kind of difficult because you don't know. If you have never been involved in a nonprofit, you don't know how long these things are going to take. but it's important to think through them for this document. You've got the first basic organizational information. You've got your organizational structure, your required provisions, your NTE code and activity descriptions, and then compensation. Who's going to get paid? How much are they going to get paid? And being careful that you look at your board from a perspective, are any of your board members getting paid for anything within the organization? And if they are, you need to really think about that. Financial information, they're going to ask you to project out the classification of the foundation, the date of exemption, other types, and then when you get through with part number 9, you get to sign it, you upload your organizing documents and your bylaws, and then guess what? You get to start raising money. As soon as you hit the go button, then you can start raising money. Now, you will need a disclaimer on the bottom of your acknowledgement letters to say that you have filed for your 501c3 status and that they will need to talk to their accountant. And if your status, 501c3 nonprofit status, comes in by the end of the year, then they may be able to deduct their donation based on what their accountant says. That's a great thing, right? Okay, so number 8, so you've submitted your 1023. You need to apply for Colorado tax exemption. And so you have to wait though until you get that 501c3 determination letter. So that means that after you submit your 1023, and there's different periods of time as to how long it's going to take you to actually get your 501c3 determination letter. Last January, the IRS went online with the form, and people were getting their 501c3 in like 6 weeks and 8 weeks. Prior to that, during the government shutdown, I had one client who waited almost 10 months for theirs. But more typical is somewhere between 3 months and 6 months is how long it takes you to get it. But again, you don't have to stop. You can continue building the nonprofit. You can continue having board meetings. You can continue raising money. Then you need to be sure you complete other state reporting and registration requirements. So just because you get your 501c3 determination letter, you aren't tax exempt from your state until you apply for your tax exempt. Okay, so hopefully if you have any questions, you can get back with me, but I did want to let you know the common mistakes that people make in creating the nonprofit. They're not clear on their mission and purpose. They don't realize that there's a difference in the bylaws, purpose of the organization, and the 1023 activity description. So you'll see that is the assignment I'm going to give you this time. And then the board engagement, really finding a board who believes in what you do. And we talked a little bit about what happens after you file for your name of the organization and if it's not quite right. So organizations sometimes are too hasty on the name. And then doing the steps out of order, because some nonprofits will try to skip forward and get the EIN number and they haven't gotten their articles of incorporation from the state yet. So following these in order. Okay, here's your assignment if you choose to take it. Write the purpose of the nonprofit for your organizing document, your bylaws, using bullet points. So you'll see that in these slides in step number 2. Write your activity description for the IRS Form 1023. That's a narrative of what your nonprofit will do. So that is step 7 of the 1023, part 4. So those are the 2 that are so important that I want you to be able to articulate when we talk for our next one, is what every nonprofit needs to know about raising money. Because again, as soon as this is done and it's submitted, you can start raising money. Well, thank you so much for being here. And please let me know if you have any questions, if there's anything I can answer for you. And I'm so excited about the progress that you're going to make with your new nonprofit.